This is the I Read Comic Books podcast. I am your host, Mike Rappin. With me this week, two stupendous individuals, Nick White.
Hey.
And Kate Scotchless.
Hello.
We are in this. I'm running off the high of New York City Comic Con and the Wictiv party. I may sound a little raspier than usual because I screamed my lungs out to a bunch of 80s pop songs last night, as you do when you're at a goth dance party. I still have glitter all over my body. It's all Tia's fault. It was fantastic. I think Tia and I might do like a mini-sode or something about it coming in the future. We'll let you guys know. But, we're here to talk about comic books, and so let me ask the question I ask every single week. How have you been? How have comic books been? Let's start with you, Kate.
I'm okay. I am chugging along here with the fall grind and trying to take some breaks between working hard, and I wanted to get in that fall spirit. So I read Pumpkinheads, which is the new one, new OGN out from Rainbow Rowell,
Nice.
with art by Faith Erin Hicks and colors by Sarah Stern.
Mm-hmm.
I was excited enough about this to just buy it sight unseen on, admittedly off of Lord Bezos' site for so much less money. See, that's the thing. Like, I want to support local shops. So first of all, I don't know where my local shop is yet because I moved, and I know the name. I have not actually found it yet. But second of all, man, when they give you like a $10 discount, it is hard to say no. So got it for only $12, which was really nice for a graphic novel. But here's the thing. Pages fell out when I read it.
What?
Of my brand new graphic novel. Yeah. Like, it wasn't sewn together properly, so pages, like, they came out two at a time. You know how they're connected? So they should have been, like, glued or sewed in. Well, they didn't, so I'm returning it. But I still read it. The story is pretty basic. I thought that it felt like it was intended for younger ages even than Rainbow Rowell's other books that I've read that were YA. So it was very simple in that sense, but I enjoyed it. So I was looking for a brain break, right? So it worked well in that sense for me. But the big thing that I wanted and why I bought it was I wanted that fall atmosphere vibe, like that makes you feel like, oh boy, crisp apple cider and fall crunchy leaves and all that stuff. And oh boy, does it deliver on that front. It was fantastic. So the other thing that I really liked about it is it was great for, like, having LGBT representation and having, like, the kids actually shaped like children, like teenagers, and being, not just exclusively white kids and all that stuff. So that like boosted it by a star on Goodreads for me, just because when you actually get to see yourself in a comic, it can be lovely and really enhance the experience.
Right.
But it's about these two kids who they're seniors in high school, so this is their last fall working at this. It says pumpkin patch, and they call it the patch all through it, but it's very much like if you live in a big city and then you go like 30 minutes out and there's an apple farm, you get these kind of like carnival-y like places that have
city slickers.
A million.
This is the escapism you've been looking for. Yeah,
exactly. And so there's like a million different things there to do and to see, like with like hayride, but also like with the bouncy house, and also the caramel apple stand, and also this. Like I actually just went to one of these outside of Lansing. And it was not as cool as the one in the book, but that's what they're at. They're working. They've both worked at the same stand at this place for every fall. And so it's their very last Halloween, and they're both sad and nostalgic about it and trying to do all the things because they're going to miss it. And because they're doing all the things, it takes you all around this this place that I want to exist and I want to go to very badly. And I think the biggest sell is if I had to pitch this to someone else, is that when I read this, I immediately after finishing it went and bought some apple cider because I had to have it. That's how in the spirit it gets you.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I definitely would recommend it. I would go into it knowing that it is going to be kind of a simple, breezy read and not expect a lot of complexity out of it. And knowing that, I think you'll have a better time.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's totally fine for a comic book too. Like sometimes you just need like a nice read, and it sounds to me like that's what this is.
Yep, and that was exactly what I needed and exactly what was delivered. And I think also when I would guess that this is probably really age appropriate for like early middle school, and I think for them it might not be quite such a simple book. There's kind of the bigger ideas of what are friends and what are, these life transitions and figuring out who you are and all the, that kind of stuff that I think if you're not in your 30s is probably a bigger concept and all that stuff to deal with. So
yeah, I've been meaning to pick this up. I'm probably going to wait until the trees actually start to change colors here in New York before I grab it. But that way
we've got some color change here.
All three of them.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, Nick, how about you? How have you been? How have comic books been?
Well, I think as some of you know, recently I decided that I would try to get a library card again because I guess misery loves company and there's enough other people going there, so I figured it was about time.
Oh my God, Nick.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
And you
faced your demons. I'm so proud of you.
Well,
the saga is it over yet? That's
only
the question.
would I think this only would have gone as well as it did, just because they didn't have any record of me of previously being there, so they weren't immediately. I didn't see the wanted poster on the wall with my name and saying wanted for keeping a GRE book out for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. So. So that went okay, and then they're like, hey, I hope this is okay, but now we're gonna take probably a week or a week and a half to mail this card, probably not even a mile, maybe 2 miles across town. And I was like, library efficiency, I almost missed you.
They mail it to you?
Oh yeah, they wouldn't give it to me.
Wow, I've never had them not just hand it to me.
That's really bizarre.
Yeah, I actually just got a library card this week too.
Well, I mean, I guess I started something, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I actually found out that, so I'd been putting it off because I thought I had to change my license first, and I didn't want to go to the Secretary of State's office. And then I found out that because East Lansing basically only exists because of Michigan State, like, the Michigan State population of East Lansing is like 50,000, and the population of East Lansing when the kids aren't there in the summer is like 10,000. So they're like, yeah, we don't care about your driver's license. If you just bring a school ID, that's fine. I'm like, oh, well, cool. Okay. So I went and did it. Sorry, I did interrupt you though. What did you get at the library?
Oh, so then they're like, you can check out 2 books right now. And so I'm like, oh, good. I'm already on probation with these people. This is fantastic.
Because someone knows. You're not in the system, but there's a rumor. There's a legend of the Nick White of the Spring Lake area,
you had that look.
I was expecting them to be like, don't worry, you're only under house arrest for the first week or something like that. And what was most hilarious is that when I went to check out the books, they're like, here's your library card number on this piece of paper, and you just give this to us, and we'll let you check out 2 books or whatever. I walk up there, and they just lean behind the counter. They take the card that they're going to mail to me, and they just scan it,
God.
and then they let me check out 2 books. And it's like...
What the
What
hell?
is going on?
It's so weird. Maybe they wanted to like confirm the address thing. Maybe they wanted to like make sure that your address is actually the address that you send to that. That seems like so over precautionary for such a small library. Like, yeah. I can understand that maybe
He
like
just
in
had
New
that
York or like
shifty
a big
look.
city. Yeah.
Well, like
Nick,
I told you, some of these people have been there forever, so I'm sure a couple of them were like, yeah, we remember him.
Mm-hmm. They've got a Lieutenant Bookman that works at their library.
So, I did finally get my card a few days ago, and I've gone to the next city over where they have a bigger selection, and I checked out a bunch of volumes of March and some other stuff, and started signing up for all the digital services that you can use, et cetera, et cetera. So, but one of the books
to the question, what did you actually read, Nick?
Yeah. So one of the books that I got via Hoopla was Locke and Key Volume 1, that's written by Joe Hill. He's Stephen King's son.
Had you
Gabriel
read that before?
Rodriguez did the art. J Photo's colors. Robbie Robbins letters. I guess I kind of forgot that the series is actually pretty old. Quote unquote pretty old as far as modern comics go. So that began in February 2008, concluded in December 13, which kind of surprised me because I thought it only wrapped a year or two ago, but I guess that's because they came back and did Locke and Key Small World 3 years ago, and then Locke and Key Heaven and Earth in 2017. I picked this book for the show because it's listed as dark fantasy / contemporary fantasy, which for me was sort of the compromise between having to read fantasy and also not having to read about a dwarf in a cave fighting orcs looking for treasure. So basically the beginning of the story is more or less the theme song of The Fresh Prince, if you're familiar with that. If instead of getting in one little fight and your mom getting scared, it's more of a slightly more mired in tragedy series of events, which result in... What's that?
I'd say in that it's not even close to the Fresh Prince story, but I like where you're going with it, sure.
Well, it's close in the sense that someone has some trouble in their life at the beginning and outset and is forced to move across the country to live with their auntie and uncle. In that sense, it is the Fresh Prince.
Okay.
I know it's a stretch. Roll with me, guys. So yeah, you have a mom and a trio of kids that survive a home invasion, and they end up moving from California to Massachusetts to live with their deceased dad's brother, where they live in this weird place called Key House, which has doors that if you go through, they turn you into a ghost. There are talking spirits that are trapped within wells on the property. I mean, it's fantasy for you. What do you want? We sort of get the idea that there's also a past generation of kids that also were involved or had knowledge of the Key House. Rodriguez really delivers on scenery and settings, but his people all feel kind of samey in their facial features. It's not bad to a point where you can't distinguish one character from another, but I think he really struggles with like drawing age, because at the beginning of the book, the kids are at the service for their dad, and some guy comes up and talks to them, and he's their uncle, but I actually thought he was another sibling for a while there. So again, like I said, like I think a lot of artists struggle with drawing age, and it's not terrible, but like, yeah, there are moments where I was like, is this like a 36-year-old adult, or is this like a high school senior? You know what I mean? Sort of those sort of situations. I do rather enjoy the key designs. I think Rodriguez is able to do sequential art. I think if you look at something like his work on Little Nemo, I think he's more at home with that. Totally. So yeah, I thought that was interesting. Am I going to continue with a little bit hesitantly, but probably. Like I said, the art wasn't great, but I think there are some interesting ideas there to work with. So.
I really have to say, I think Rodriguez's art gets phenomenally better as the series goes on. So I know that like you may because you got to think about it. Little Nemo came out 2017, right? This is
maybe
way
like 15,
after,
yeah.
Oh, 2015, but still, this is way after Lock and Key. And I think as the story progresses and you get more into the horror elements of it, I think you'll start to enjoy his art a lot more. I'll just say that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we forget sometimes that comic book artists, not unlike practicing in any other field, you can see improvement. People do, work, hone their craft, as you will. Also, briefly, I did read Head Lopper by Andrew McLean, who wrote and did the art, and Mike Spicer, who did the colors. I'll discuss this book later, but more or less, if you're looking for a pretty paint-by-numbers fantasy narrative, but with a nice, fresh coat of very stylized paint, I think this would do well, provided you're leaning more towards action, sort of sword and sandal fantasy than, say, freaking lore dumps where you're learning the economic system of a city-state.
Yeah.
What about you, Mike?
For me, I read just a handful of books. I've been super busy, so I didn't have time to sit down to read much, but I did decide, like, I made a conscious effort. I've started it so many times, I was like, I gotta finish it. I finished Little Bird number 1 through 5. This is by Darcy Van Polgeest, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, with art by Ian Bertram. And all I can really say is that this book is super gross, but I love it. Like, it totally, like, Ian Bertram's art gets that visceral, disgusting goriness of bloody fights. And I think the dude's an incredibly talented artist. I don't really care for some of the ways that he draws people, like their faces, but on the whole, his art is stupendous. There are massive spreads of just huge cityscapes and like huge fights that are happening, and like, I don't think another artist could have tackled them as well as Bertram's art could have. He kind of reminds me of like this strange level of intricacy that you'd see on someone like Martin Morizzi, or sorry, who's the guy that's on Ice Cream Man, right? Did I get that right? Morazzo, excuse me, Martin Morazzo, I misspoke. Or the guy who did Orkstein, whose
James
name
Stokoe.
I can't remember. Yeah, James Stokoe. Like, you get this weird level of detail that like seems unnecessary, but any less would have made the book worse off.
Didn't Bertram do House of Penance with Peter Tomasi?
I think so. And yeah, so I think, like, I don't know, the book was wild. The story is kind of chaotic, and it's very like empowering about like rising up against the growing terribleness of the world. But it's super crazy cyberpunk dystopian future stuff that I can totally get into, and it was an enjoyable read. I think if you're not a fan of gory comics, this definitely isn't for you, but on the whole, it was a pretty solid book, so I'd recommend that Volume 1 if you can get it.
Yeah, I definitely, I know who you're talking about, Ian Bertram. He drew one issue of Batman Eternal, that weekly book when they were celebrating Batman's anniversary. And as you can imagine, a lot of people, and again, I'm painting with a wide brush here, but people used to looking at, I don't know, Jason Fabok and Doug Mankey's art. Imagine that after a couple weeks of stuff like that, you have Ian Bertram drawing the issue of Batman. People did not know what to do with themselves.
Yeah, I could get that. I mean, I think his art can be a little bit jarring, but on the whole,
it reminds me of Quietly in some ways.
Yeah, I was going to say, it does remind me a lot of Frank Quietly. So if that's your bag, I think you'll dig this book. And again, it kind of reminds me of like Extremity or even Luther Strode to a certain bit, if you were into those books, where there's a lot of gore, but there's a lot of heart in the book as well. So yeah, I don't know, if you're looking for a good fight book that's just got explosions and kills and deaths and really crazy cyberpunk. I want to keep saying cyberpunk, but like that's not really an accurate description of it. But yeah, it's very solid. I really liked it. But yeah, we got to move on. Let's move on and talk about comic books that are coming out this upcoming week. Comics are dropping on October 9th, 2019. What are you both excited for this week? I'm going to kick it back to you, Nick.
So for me, the book I'm interested in is The Twilight Man, Rod Serling and the Birth of Television. This is written and drawn by, oh boy, I got a tough one this week, Corin Shadme. Sorry, Corin. And also sorry if I mispronounced your name incorrectly the second time, too. So this book is from Humanoids. And what it is it's part of their series called Life Drawn. And it's sort of an autobiographical imprint of theirs. They've also done books on Hedy Lamarr, Marilyn Monroe. Shadme perhaps is best known for recently illustrating Rise of the Dungeon Master, again, sort of an autobiographical thing about Gary Gygax and the creation of D&D, which was, I think it was 2017. He also teaches at the School for Visual Arts in NYC. He's had his art in pretty much any and every newspaper and magazine. But as for the book, as they put it, it focuses on, quote, a biographical tale that follows Hollywood revolutionary Rod Serling's rise to fame in the golden age of television and his descent into his own personal Twilight Zone. So obviously, for those who are unaware, he pretty much created the Twilight Zone. If you haven't seen the Twilight Zone, and you're into sci-fi or fantasy or speculative fiction, or just narratives in general. I would highly recommend it. I've always known a little bit about him, how he was kind of a revolutionary. He was trying to push sort of touchy subjects at the time about trying to get dialogues about race and poverty and injustice and things like this on the air. And as you might imagine, the TV censors and the TV executives weren't really amiable to these ideas, because guess what? You can't really sell those concepts to advertisers very well.
Right.
And so he always, was getting creative and doing stories that were more about aliens and about monsters and about dystopian futures, but they were not that, sometimes subtly, sometimes not that subtly, allegories for problems plaguing, society. And so it's one of those things where I know a little, but I'd like to know more. And so I'm very interested, and I've seen the introductory art, and it looks quite good.
Yeah, I love that a story like this is being done as a comic book. I think that's a really beautiful way to tell this story, especially something that's going to be very visual, regarding television and things like that. I think should be really cool. I didn't even know this was coming out. I might have to check this out as well. Kate, what about you? What are you excited for this week?
I, first of all, want to say that I've never watched The Twilight Zone, and that's like eternally one of those things that's like, I need to go back and do that, because that's such an integral part. Like, so many shows were influenced by that show that I do watch and love, that I should go back and watch that. And I also should read this book. You really sold me. I am excited for, and this is a mouthful because Marvel loves its names, Journey to Star Wars, The Rise of Skywalker, Allegiance #1.
Semicolon. First chapter.
Yeah, exactly.
Act
exactly.
2. Yep.
So this is a prequel series for the new movie. It's written by Ethan Sachs with art by Luke Ross, colors by Lee Lowridge, and it's, So usually I'm not into these. I will just start out saying, but because my big thing is I get thrown by art when they're trying to draw the actors. So the facial is very hard to do well in comics. Or just as an artist, drawing people is hard. Drawing faces that are real people is very hard. But there's several preview pages for this book out. Not if you go directly to Marvel's page that's selling it, but actually the news articles and stuff. They clearly sent this to some outlets. And that's what really sold me, because the art is the beautiful, beautiful Star Wars art that I love. That's all the vibrant colors and the alien planets and the starships, and it looks fantastic. So the story is, second. Who cares about the story, right? But it's the delegation led by Leia and Rey is going over to the Mon Calamari and asking them to join the rebel fight, which they are not wanting to do. And meanwhile, Poe and Finn are off hunting down a weapons cache on a remote moon, and they're being hunted by a notorious criminal gang. So Star Wars stuff is happening. People are running around trying to talk to people, trying to fight people, Star Wars stuff. And this is going to feed into the movie. So it's all set directly before the new movie, which I am very hyped about. Plus, the new show's coming out soon. We get the Disney streaming service rolls out on November 12th, and we get our Star Wars show with that. Yeah,
Mandalorian.
Mike and I have gone in halvesies on this. Well, not quite halvesies. There's other people roped into this.
Something like that. We got a lot of people involved.
Maybe you shouldn't be disclosing this on the internet.
Yeah, I don't know. We don't know. Listen, we all live in the same household. It's fine. Okay?
We're family in spirit.
Yes.
Household. Is that like a global village thing? Is that...
Yes. Yes, the earth is our house.
The earth is our mother. We're all her children.
Yes, and therefore she houses all of us at the same time.
The earth is our house, and we can't get anyone to clean up from this terrible party we've been having for the last 100 years.
This allegory is working for me.
Yeah. Well, for me this week, I'm excited about Outer Darkness number 11. I have a really small week, so I couldn't really find anything else that I was super jazzed about. The synopsis for this issue is sex priests, haunted hallucinogens, and barbarian mercenary lizards. Oh my. I never know what to expect about this book. I never know what to predict. John Layman is constantly surprising me with his creativity, and Afu-chan is doing a stupendous job bringing those ideas to life in color, and it's just a beautiful book. If you're not reading Outer Darkness, you gotta get on it, people. It's so good. That's all I can really say about it. I'm just excited for another issue of this book because it is by far the best Image book that's being published right now, hands down.
Huh.
Yeah. I'm just going to say that. I'm just going to lay it all out. I mean, I've been preaching to the choir, I think, for a long time about this, but I do really love that book. I think it's stupendous, and John Layman is doing such fun work with this book, and it's illustrated in the best way. Like, every character is so rich. Every beat of the story is interesting, and it's so far seemed to mostly be like a series of little one-shots with kind of an overarching thing, but I don't know. We haven't really seen the other shoe drop yet, and I really like that. I'm so willing to take a risk on the rest of this book to just see what else John Layman wants to do, and because it's that interesting, it's that fun, and it plays really well on like a good mix of sci-fi with a little bit of fantasy injected. Yeah, but we're going to talk about all of that stuff after the break, where we're going to dive deep into fantasy comics, what we like, what we don't like, and it turns out Nick's never read a fantasy comic before this past week.
Whoa.
We're going to discuss all that when we come back in just a second. For our show this week, we are talking about fantasy comic books. And in specific, we're kind of asking the question, what do you like in terms of fantasy in general as a genre? And I realize that this kind of goes beyond just comic books, but I did want to focus it back into comics, specifically to ask the question, like, where do we draw the line when it comes to fantasy? What actually is considered fantasy? And I made the joke before we took our break here that Nick had never read a fantasy book up until this week. That's probably not
Joke's
true.
on you. Can't even read.
I mean, it's definitely not true. But the conversations that we've had leading up to this episode, Nick and I have had like one-on-one chats, like, what actually is considered fantasy? And I know we can dive into the nitty-gritty of it, but Kate and Nick, I kind of wanted to hear your takes on it in terms of what you consider to be quote-unquote fantasy, and which of those fantasy-type books you actually prefer. Maybe you can give some examples, or you can just talk about what you dig on when it comes to the fantasy genre in general. So, Kate, I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to hand it over to you. Let's start with that.
So in a very personal, not academic or realistic definition for anyone other than me, but when I'm like thinking, oh my gosh, I want to read fantasy books, I love fantasy books. In every genre, I love fantasy stories. That's my favorite. That is my jam. I'm thinking about world building. I want to escape into a fantasy world that's different from our own, even if it's only slightly different. With usually there's magic involved. I love well-defined magic systems. There's usually some questing happening, which I deeply appreciate, and discovery or mystery of trying to figure out how different things in the world work. And what kind of separates it from sci-fi for me, even if it's set in the future, sci-fi tends to have more of a tech-focused, where there's, space travel and high-tech-y devices or whatever. But one of the things that struck me right away when I tried to brainstorm for this episode was thinking about, like, some of the initial things that came to mind weren't actually fantasy comics, I don't think. Like, Saga was one of the first things that came to mind, but then I was like, well, wait, isn't that significantly more sci-fi? And I think a lot of comics kind of blend that sci-fi fantasy genre in really interesting ways, where you have both magic and advanced technology side by side, which is, I think, extremely fun and interesting. But I don't know about you guys. What makes it fantasy for you?
I think Saga's an interesting comic. I didn't even consider that, because to me, I think it's a space opera.
Yeah.
It's
No,
in the
you're
same
right.
vein of something like, it's in the same vein as something like Star Wars, right?
Yeah.
Where there's a lot of drama and there's some crazy stuff, and I'm going to call the Force magic. I don't care what anyone says. It's magic.
It is.
So there's a lot of blend between, sci-fi and fantasy, but it is, in my mind, still more sci-fi than anything. Like,
Yeah,
Saga
I mean,
to me is still more tech focused and like structured system focused than a fantasy book.
The whole thing with the lightsaber is like, basically it's the whole magic sword trope, right? Our intrepid hero is given a magic sword and has to go on a quest with it. That's like so bread and butter fantasy. But then you throw that into space, and I love it so much.
Exactly. Nick, I know that you and we kind of talked about, like, where do you start to draw the line on this? I know I want to pitch it over to you, because I know you did quite a big deep dive, as you always do, which I appreciate a lot.
That's why we love you, Nick.
Yeah.
Well, first off, the Force is not magic, and that's the exact sort of thing I would expect from someone whose midichlorian count is not over 9,000, so I just double memed right there for those not keeping score.
Thank you.
Anyway, midichlorians are bullshit. Who cares?
Yeah.
So yeah, I'll admit this. When I read this week's topic, and I was like, all right, what am I preparing for? And the immediate thought was, do I really read fantasy comics? And then I was like, oh well, we're off to a great start now, Nick. This is this is great territory to be in. And then, of course, I was like, do I really have a firm grasp on what defines this genre? Am I going to have to be that guy who, like, introduces his, like, 11th grade English essay with the dictionary defines fantasy comics as... And you know what? Yes, I am that guy, so fuck you. So, Wikipedia calls it a genre of speculative fiction set in a fictional universe, which... That seems redundant.
Well, it's been nice talking to you guys. Bye.
Yeah, exactly. It's often inspired by real-world myth and folklore. I think that's a part we can fixate on. I went looking for a couple other people. Merriam-Webster says it's fiction featuring especially strange settings and grotesque creatures, which is like... That's a little bit of tunnel vision there, Merriam-Webster. That's a little honed in. Don't know what I think about that. But then, as Kate said... Usually there's magic. Usually there's witchcraft. Frequently it's in a medieval setting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I only started grasping for this because I always used to think of fantasy as being, as I said earlier, more or less, it's an elf with a bow in the woods or in a cave. He's looking for treasure. There's probably an orc somewhere. Somebody's got a shield and somebody's casting magic missile, right? And I tell this to people just to upset them more or less, and then they tell me, no. Fantasy is so much more than this. It's so much bigger. It's expanded so much. It's it's so much more than that. And I'm like, well, first off, that whole, looking for treasure in a cave, that's not necessarily bad, but that's what I think of. And so when I read these things and all of these different elements that they talk about being fantasy, well, then I'm like, well, is Sixth Gun fantasy then? Or is Hellboy fantasy then? Or is Gideon Falls fantasy? And then a couple people I've talked to have been like, no, that's not fantasy. That's horror with fantasy elements.
Yeah, I mean,
and then
that's where like you start to get...
What's quote unquote pure fantasy then, which pure is a loaded word. Maybe that's not what we're going to go with here, but what's fantasy not acting as a supplementary element to something else? And then I go, are you going to tell me that it's the dwarf in the cave hoarding his treasure? Because then we're back where we started. Anyway, this has been Rambling with Nick White for 4 minutes. I hope you learned nothing.
But to get to what you're saying, I mean, I think, like, to me, when I think of what is a a fantasy comic book, right? I think of Conan the Barbarian. I think Heathen. I think the Skullkickers. Rat Queens, Hex 11. Well, actually, sorry, Hex 11's an actual. I'm going to put an asterisk on that one.
Skullkickers.
Even Skullkickers, Pathfinder comic books, the D&D comic books, they take the fantasy genre and then they lay it out just in like a Tolkien-esque way to say, like, here's a world, here's all this myth and folklore, here's all this stuff. Because I think the core difference between like sci-fi and fantasy is that there's a lot of folklore. Like, I think that definition from Wikipedia is not that wrong. I think it's a simplification, but of course all definitions are going to be a simplification like that. But the thing that makes the books that I just listed different than something like Sixth Gun, which I've never read, or Hellboy, I think is that, like you said, the fantasy is the supplement. It's not the core of the book. The core of the book is a different genre, and it just happens to use those tropes. I realize I'm like reiterating what you're saying, but I truly agree with that, because you can look at something like Nimona, which is a book that Kate put on her list, and Nimona to me feels pretty strongly fantasy, but it's definitely a comedy book. But I wouldn't say that the fantasy aspect of it is supplementary to the core of the story, because the fantasy element is the core of the story, and it just happens to be a comedy.
Yeah.
So I don't know. There's that genre blending that we're going to see, and I think that's going to be a core point of discussion here is where do you draw the line? Can you draw the line? There's, of course, I think the mentality out there that you really shouldn't draw the line. If someone sees something as fantasy, good, let them have it. But we're here to have that discussion, is to say, where can we draw the line? And I think a lot of the books that you have listed, Nick, are really interesting, and they straddle the line between actual fantasy and like a blend of genres, and where fantasy is the supplement. Sorry, Kate, go ahead.
I was going to say, back to our, now that we're all library members chatting here, I've noticed more and more libraries, especially smaller ones, are not separating out subgenres in their collection, where they just are actually shelving them all as fiction because of this struggle where...
or nerd shit. That's what it says in my library. Just a collective category.
Honestly, I love when they separate out the sci-fi and fantasy for me, because that makes my search so much faster and easier. But a lot of libraries aren't doing that anymore because of this overlap, where something might be a mystery and an urban fantasy, or it might be both science fiction and fantasy, or it might be magical realism, but not enough people even know that, so that then it's just like a normal YA book, that kind of, that there's so much crossover between these subgenres, and where things are both at the same time, that a lot of people are going, whatever. File it all in one basket.
Yeah,
but is that bad? I don't know if that's necessarily
bad. I
think
they don't have a choice. I think the way things are blending so much right now, you don't have a choice.
Yeah.
Because beyond that, you're going to have people sitting down and like parsing through the book, or trying to teach a computer to distinguish between and then make the ultimate decision on whether it's sci-fi or fantasy.
I'm inclined to say just have the author define what subgenre they want to put it in, and call it good. But at that point,
well, Kate, modern literary critique would tell you that literary intentions on the part of the author are no longer
right.
It's no longer something we dwell on as much or give prominence to as much as we used to. So,
well, that's a whole evolution of how we view fiction. I think as a culture.
Right now, the bottom line is it's a struggle, right? Like, we can already tell that we're debating over this. And one thing I thought of when I was looking through my notes so frequently is just that lumping together category of, we see it so much, sci-fi / fantasy. It's just sci-fi fantasy. Mm-hmm. And I think the prominence of that, I think the popularity of that, I think that flat out speaks to the fact that without me having to bring out the Arthur C. Clarke quote on technology, sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, I think is what it is. I think really just gets at the heart of things. And so coming all the way back around, I think it's that blurring and that blending, and especially the blurring and blending with sci-fi, that makes it so difficult to say what are your favorite fantasy books, because you either struggle with that question or you have to sort of mutate the question into what are your favorite, I don't know, fantasy adjacent books.
Right. Well, like, one that I was thinking about is, like, Pretty Deadly. Like, I'm like, oh, yeah, that's totally fantasy. I'm like, wait a minute. It's definitely more Western, I think, than fantasy. And there's stuff like that. There's a lot of Western books that are comics that are like that.
So if you want to talk Western fantasy, now we're getting into Six of Gun. Now we're getting into East of West.
Isn't Manifest Destiny like that, too?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, but like, there's again this, but I think the core of that is to say the core, like the primary genre in that book is Western. It just uses fantasy elements.
Well, who's to say, Michael?
Well, I am to say. That's what I'm fucking doing right now. Is I'm saying it because
that's
I think that there is like there are books.
Like for me, Hellboy is more fantasy than horror. Maybe that's just because
No, I actually would agree with that. I think that Hellboy is definitely more fantasy than horror. Whereas on the flip side of that, like Harrow County is way more horror than fantasy, but it uses a lot of fantasy elements in it. You know, so like, but I think that there are authors out there who are trying to create books, and the one that comes to mind to me every time for this kind of discussion is Jim Butcher with his Dresden Files series. Right, that book to me is a pure fantasy book, and we put it in that subgenre of urban fantasy. That takes place where things are like fantastical and but they take place in like a modern day, so you kind of have to deal with technology as part of the story. But Jim Butcher gets interesting and gets to sneak around that by saying, oh yeah, wizards have a really hard time with tech, so they just don't ever use it. Which, like, that's fine, sure, that's how you skirt around it. But I think that at the core of that book, it's the fantasy elements, it's the magic, it's the lore, it's all of the spells that Harry has to come up with, all the mythos that he has to learn about is at the core of that book. And if you were to erase all of the modern portions of that book and instead replace it with like a typical medieval setting, you'd go, damn, that's a fantasy book. I think if you start to like strip away some of the environment variables of some of these books, you can really start to cut down to the core of what that book actually is. And in defining the genre for, I think that like, and maybe this may be me being a little bit harsh and trying to like categorize things too much, but I think like when we're looking at something like an East of West, Nick, that's the book that keeps breaking my brain in this conversation. East of West, I think when you drill down to what it is at the core, I don't think it's a sci-fi book. I think it's a fantasy. It's probably more of a Western than anything. But I think it's more of a fantasy than anything else. Because even with all the tech and all of the stuff that's going on, that is, to take the Arthur C. Clarke quote to heart, is just another form of magic. It's just done a different way.
Well, again, you've got like the four harbingers of the apocalypse and all of that stuff going on. And
I mean, if you look at the Bible, it's just a big fantasy book, right? Like,
oh boy,
no, I mean,
we're not going to veer into that topic.
No, he's taking these myths and these lore,
absolutely,
else
about revelations in the end time. Sure, absolutely,
yeah. So I mean, I think, I don't know. There's a lot of books that kind of draw like themselves like just over the line of one genre or another. But I think you can break them down. I guess to actually get to the question, I mean, like, what kind of fantasy comics do you like? Now that we've kind of established like a semblance of understanding as to what that means, what kind of fantasy books do you guys like? I know we've got a bunch of things written down. I kind of wrote down some pure, what I consider to be like true fantasy, like honestly just
classic
fantasy comics.
I guess you could say, maybe. Yeah, classic fantasy.
But yeah, I'm curious to know what kind of stuff you like. Kate, I know you've got a list. Nick, you've got a list as well. So let's start with yours, Kate, because I know, Nick, you just wrote down stuff to make this discussion harder.
To be a real edgelord.
No, you have some great points, so I want to get to them. But Kate, what about you? What are some of your favorites?
So going back to like I wrote stuff down, but now that we're having this discussion, I'm like, crap, Witches is more horror than fantasy. So cross that one out. Pretty Deadly, more Western than fantasy. Cross that one off. Nimona definitely is one of my favorites. Wictive, I feel like that's a fantasy book. As soon as you add a bunch of god and goddesses, if there's a pantheon involved, I was going to say, that's a real fantasy.
Mythology heavy.
Yeah. So I love that series. I need to catch up. But now that you know how you get to the series where you're behind enough and they're far enough in with it ending that you're like, well, I'm just going to wait until it's now totally over to buy the last like 2 volumes I'm missing and then read it all at once. I'll just do a complete reread. I think Rat Queens is very classic sword and sorcery type comic that I love. Bone scratches that fantasy itch for me. I don't know if you guys would consider Bone a fantasy comic.
God, I wish I'd read it. I wish I'd read Bone. I haven't, and I feel bad about it. I know.
If anything else, I don't know where you would put it.
Yeah.
Otherwise,
I think just
it's
children.
It's a story about adventure.
Yeah, it's
right?
an adventure story with creatures but to that end, it's very much just sort of children's mythos type stuff. But I Kill Giants, to me, I don't know that I'd call it a fantasy comic. Maybe I would. I certainly did when I was making the list. But its use of fantasy elements to depict the inner struggles of its main character, I think, it's one of, if not my favorite comic. And I think its use of fantasy is probably one of the best uses of fantasy elements that I've ever seen in comics. So I wanted that on this list.
Well, that actually kind of brings up an interesting side question of this. It's like, why did those elements ring so true to you, especially in a book like I Kill Giants, when like the primary focus of the book isn't really in a fantasy world. It's more of a drama, like a story that's kind of got a weird slice of life edge to it.
Yep.
But the fantasy elements, it sounds to me, it like is what made the book work on a whole level for you. Like it rounded the circle for you.
Yeah, I think.
What would you say like drives you to that?
What drives me to fantasy in the first place?
Well, yeah, I mean, like, what makes I Kill Giants work so much better because of those fantasy elements? Or what drives you to fantasy in general, yeah?
Well, the world as a sick, sad place, as Daria would say. And so I like the escapism of science fiction and fantasy, and always have. I think the thing with I Kill Giants that makes it feel very fantasy to me, outside of having mythical creatures of the giants, is the magic weapon. As soon as our hero has a magic weapon that only they can use to stop the forces of evil kind of thing, that feels very fantasy to me, because I've read and watched and consumed so much high fantasy. And the weaving in, I think it's very hard to depict the inner life of children accurately in a way that feels real, especially feels real looking back as an adult. And I thought that without massive spoilers, I thought that was just really expertly done. I think one of the other things that really works in that series is that it's a maxi, that it has an end. Because with a lot of fantasy series, you have a really excellent world building and exploring in the first few things, but they kind of can explode out of control. There's like that exponential boom in the mythology and the magic system, and as it keeps going, and they can kind of outgrow themselves in a way that then I tend to lose interest. And I think that it being self-contained in that way worked extremely well.
Gotcha. We'll throw it over to you, Nick. I mean, what are some of your favorite fantasy books that are out there, or maybe not so fantasy books?
Quote fantasy, unquote fantasy. Yeah. I enjoyed Lock and Key so far. I'll probably continue that, and to hear your optimistic words on that will just be a little bit more encouragement in that direction. Hellboy is definitely one for me. As I said, I think a lot of people want to put this as a horror book just right off the bat. I think that they see that as just naturally the category it falls into, because it's about a demon, I guess. I don't know. But it's so focused on like the mythos of religion, apocryphal religion, relics and age-old items that have been bestowed with certain abilities.
It feels very fantasy to me, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
I think so. I mean, and there's definitely a boatload of monstrous mythological creatures being slain and whatnot that I don't really see it belonging in horror quite as much as other people do. So yeah, I think that really belongs in fantasy, if anything else. Little Nemo, the more recent one, obviously it was originally a comic strip in the early 20th century. Shout out to Winsor McCay, who I think he technically lived in Spring Lake for a long time. I don't think he was born there, but and I guess maybe that also just has to do with me having a huge fondness for the little Nemo NES game, which if you haven't played that and you have a desire to fling a console through a window, check that out, everyone. This is kind of cheating, but I'm still going to include it. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is actually a bit of a fantasy book, and that might be more reboot centric. But
okay,
media tie-in.
Yeah, but if you're looking at sort of the reincarnation and mystical elements of the current iteration, they're dealing with I think several like witches and characters that are derived from Japanese mythology. So there's some of that going on. Again, it's not ever present, but it certainly is a crucial part of developing the book's origins, if anything else. As I said earlier, Sixth Gun for me is one in terms of having these relics and items with mystical / religious, I think, origins. It's been a while, but and yes, a lot of the remainder of Sixth Gun is really Western oriented, action oriented, but there's certainly a good amount of the supernatural in there. There's certainly a good amount of weird creatures and things like that. And magic, and I think there's even some like voodoo related stuff too. I think it's in like volume 4. It really needs a reread on my part. Berserker Unbound, obviously.
Yeah.
And obviously that takes this very sword and sandal Conan origin and twists it, but that is where it begins. So I guess that's something. What else?
I mean, I mean, we could continue to list comics here. I guess the question that I want to get to is the same I asked is Kate is, what works for you with these fantasy elements? Like what drives you to
if I were to
books?
take this list, what's the common thread for me?
Yeah.
I think really the common thread in a lot of them, and it probably is pretty easily reflected by the conversation we've had so far, is that it's not so much the traditionalist fantasy stuff that interests me. It's how it's being blended and set alongside other genres and mashed up. It's really those sorts of things that interest me. And again, it's not to say that you can't tell a great quote-unquote traditional fantasy narrative. And it's not to say that people aren't doing that. But I guess for me, and again, brighter creative people might not feel that, more creative people might not feel this way. But for me, quote-unquote traditional fantasy feels restrictive. And so for me, the stuff that I find more interesting are the people that are smashing it with other genres and creating, interesting byproducts from that, I guess. Gotcha.
How about you, Mike?
I mean, I just love traditional fantasy to death. I don't know what it is. It's funny because I've never been like, I'm the exact opposite of you, Nick. I think that's really funny because I think that the traditional stuff, like I never was like even a fan of Lord of the Rings, but like I love everything that came out because of Lord of the Rings in a lot of ways. Like the idea that we talked about of, like massive world building with like characters and intricate magic systems and all this stuff. I read more fantasy prose books than probably anything else. I try to read a lot of sci-fi, but like fantasy prose is always what I fall back on because it's fucking bread and butter for me. And so, like, when I think of comics, like, things that really work for me are things like Heathen or Skullkickers or Rat Queens. I mean, I know we talked about all these, but, like, it's funny because you'd think that, like, the D&D comics or the Pathfinder comics would work for me, but I never really got into those books because they really relied on, like, the meta narrative of themselves, understanding that, like, this is a comic book about D&D, and it's, like, someone is playing this game, quote-unquote. But I always really dig that kind of stuff. Like, and I mentioned a book called Hex 11 earlier because I think like that book is set in more of like an urban fantasy style or urban fantasy setting, and I think people could say that you could argue that it is like a little bit more sci-fi than fantasy, but the whole book is about magic. It's all focused on magic. It just looks really futuristic. And yeah, so I mean, something like that, like I read it and I immediately fell in love with it, and I pretty much do that with any book that just pulls in fantasy elements like that. Like I mentioned Outer Darkness earlier, and like that book super works for me because it's a blend of my two favorite things, which is, you know, sci-fi and fantasy, but in an absurd way that isn't trying to poke fun at itself. It's like, nah, dude, this is just how the world works. We have a god that powers the engine of this ship that allows us to, you know, do faster than light travel. It's like, oh, okay. It's like, just deal with it. That's the lore, you know? And magic is a core component of every ship. It's not like a one-off thing. Oh, we found a magician on a weird planet. No, like every ship has like a lead magician and a bunch of subordinate magicians, but there's also like a lead mathematician who also has a subordinates of mathematicians and stuff. It's such a cool mix of the two things that I really love in like fiction and, you know, in sci-fi and fantasy all in one, without, again, like I said, poking fun at itself and making notes that, yeah, this is a mix of both, guys, get over it. I think John Layman does a great job of taking himself seriously as he's writing this book, whereas something like Rat Queens doesn't take itself seriously, but the lore of that world is very true. Like the characters themselves are jokesters and dummies, but the actual like world and world building is like super solid. I think Curtis Weeb, I think his name is. I totally forgetting. And now the guy that just took over, I think they're doing a great job of like telling a really good fantasy story that is a really fun time to read. I'm also the type of person that takes his fantasy very seriously, like in the sense that like when I'm reading a fantasy book, like I don't want jokes. I don't want anything fun. I just want like the struggles of people who don't have guns.
Good Lord. Well, I think... Go ahead, Mike.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Nick.
Okay, I was going to say, I think what helps books like Nimona and books like Rat Queens, which I think, you know, you could argue are more traditional fantasy, is that for me, like their speech patterns, their you know, language, word conversation choices, and the sense of humor in those books, I would argue, is more modern.
Yeah.
You know, the way that they speak with each other, you're not getting a lot of thous, thou shall, blah blah blah, like you would get in a more traditional high fantasy. People are talking like they talk now, and like I said, the sense of humor seems a little bit more, I don't know, like some popular, I guess you would say, quote unquote, traditional fantasy books always kind of make me think of Adventure Time, in the sense that it's equipped with more traditional high fantasy elements, but the sense of humor and the quirkiness or the crudeness of it sometimes is geared towards a modern audience and almost seems a little bit anachronistic.
Yeah, I can totally see that. And again, this is where I'm like, I want my fantasy as serious as possible, right? Like I want the thous and you shall not speak to me. I'm the High Lord of the city. Like you know, shit like that. Like that's what I want. It's like it's for some reason I totally dig on it. But not to say that like modern takes on fantasy are bad at all. Like I think that they have their place and they super work. Like, you know, I just mentioned a couple that I really enjoy. Like I think even something like Heathen, which has it's a weird mix of modern and traditional like dialogue and characters, in terms of like someone like Odin or Freya in the comic book. You know, they speak in kind of a different way than Adis does, where she's kind of a normal layperson and they're fucking gods. Of course they're going to speak a little bit differently, but it still feels like a more modern feel to describe it the way that you put it, Nick. But something like Rat Queens, I totally get those books, but man, at the end of the day, if you had to give me a choice between like super serious fantasy and like a modern style fantasy, I'd pick the serious one every time. I just want some rhyme and reason in my world. That's all. But yeah, I guess I don't know. We've been kind of chatting for a little while. I'd love to hear what people out there think of fantasy comics if you're reading any. I know that we probably could go on and on about books that have exploded over the last couple years with fantasy. Like Fair Lady was a book that came out that I think unfortunately was cut short. Really cool fantasy book. There's a ton of stuff that I think fantasy books are starting to grow a little bit more, especially in the comic book world. So I'd be curious to know what drives other people to fantasy books or what they consider to be fantasy, because I've never considered some of those books, Nick, and I'm glad you brought them up. So you guys have any final thoughts on fantasy comics in general? Anything you definitely recommend to someone that you know is fantasy?
I would recommend I Kill Giants and Bone to literally anyone on the planet. I think I could easily hand those two. I think Wictive is a really common recommendation I give to people, but I do find out what they like before giving it to them, because I think that's a little more intense to get into and follow than either of those other books.
I get that.
Partially because, well, compared to I Kill Giants, it's a bigger commitment. There's a lot more to it. And compared to Bone, it's just a much heavier read.
Right. What about you, Nick? Any recommendations you'd give to people in terms of fantasy books, or any final thoughts on fantasy?
Like Britannia from Valiant, for me, I think is a perfect choice. It's relatively self-contained. It's an interesting sort of collision of being a period piece about the Roman Empire juxtaposed alongside magic and mythology and folklore, and kind of dealing with a character who, as like the first modern detective, he's like, guess what? Like, if you believe it's raining because the gods are angry, or if you believe that you had a great harvest because they love you, he's like, guys, I cracked the code. Like, none of that stuff is real. But then he also gets sent to, I forget the name for it at the time, but he gets sent to the where the Romans were. God, I can't remember the name of it, but it's basically when they were showing up in England, more or less, and trying to take over that area, and it starts to come into contact with some stuff that may or may not be quote unquote real magic. So Britannia would be one. It seems stupid to recommend Hellboy, because it's like, it's almost like recommending like Justice League to someone. It's like either they already know about it or not, but whatever. Demon Knights is really interesting if you wanted a pretty traditional fantasy book in terms of the fantasy staples and archetypes, but you wanted it within DC canon. And that was a New 52 launch book, and of course it was kind of a weird, quirky little title, so it lasted longer than I think most people thought, but not as long as some of us wanted.
Right.
And then something like Birthright is just great if you want to really smash together like a modern mystery sort of, very grounded in our world, and yet also very grounded in a pretty traditional fantasy world simultaneously.
Definitely.
Did it go on for too long? Yeah, probably. But you could still try it. I mean, otherwise, if you're done with Hellboy, just jump onto Witchfinder or BPRD. Like, Mike Mignola's got you covered. Like, just because you're done with his flagship book doesn't mean you can't continue to hide in that universe forever, because there's a whole bunch of other wonderful stuff. Mike, put my check in the mail, please. And that's Mike Mignola. I mean, Mike, you can send me a check too, but Mike
probably
Mignola,
not.
It's you said it would be here by now. So.
One thing that's interesting to me is, to any non-comics people, pretty much all comics are fantasy genre, right? Like, all the capes they'd consider fantasy books. They're about people with superpowers, and like, especially when you're talking about like Wonder Woman,
any comic is a fantasy comic if you're brave enough.
Oh my God, no.
Yeah.
Okay, well, but you know what I mean? Like, it's funny that we're kind of.
Yeah, I mean, we're dissecting things maybe down a bit too much. But I think. Yeah, maybe they'd see that. I think they would probably say, oh, that's sci-fi fantasy. They would just call it both, right? So That's really interesting. Oh, man. See, there's another 20 minutes worth of discussion, but, we have to wrap up. We might have to revisit this. I say that a lot. I've been saying that a lot recently because we've been having some fantastic conversations. But Kate and Nick, I want to thank you guys for being on the show this week. You remember you can follow us all on Twitter. You can follow Nick at Death Star Plans. You can follow me at Mike Rappin. And you can follow the show at IRCB Podcast as well on Twitter and Instagram, I should say.
We would love it if you went ahead and subscribed to our Patreon. You can go access that at patreon.com/IRCB podcast. Without your support, this show wouldn't survive. If you join now, you can get access to exclusive audio. You can get access to episodes a full day early. We've got articles on there. We've got previews of our schedule. We've got access to show notes. It's everything. Our Goodreads group is a wonderful community of comic friends, and we have weekly threads. One of this week's threads that we would love to have you go ahead and check out is our discussion of the October book of the month, They Called Us Enemy. Head on over there whenever you have the opportunity. It's great discussion. It's wonderful people. It's a very, very well-engaged community. There's always someone wanting to talk about something.
You can also find us at ircbpodcast.com. You can check out our pronunciation guide of comic book creator names, our Discord server, zines, merch, and everything else IRCB. If you haven't already, please rate and review our show on iTunes and beyond, and we'll read your review on the next episode. You can also email the show with what you've been reading, recipes, corrections, whatever you feel like, at ircbpodcast@gmail.com.
Infinity Shred is the best band in the universe. They do all of the music for our show. We want to thank them for the many years of support they've given us. Xander is a high wizard of the greatest kind. He blesses us with his presence once a week to deliver an episode onto us. He's also a really cool dude. He's our editor. I want to say thank you to Kate and Nick for being on the show. Thank you to everyone for listening. You guys are amazing. I'm so happy to actually talk to everybody about New York City Comic Con stuff this weekend. So thank you again for all your support. And until next time, comic books are good, and so are you.